Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am speaking with Mark Atwood Lawrence. Mark is the Associate Professor of History, Distinguished Fellow at the Robert S. Strauss Center for International Security and Law, and Director of Graduate Studies at the Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas in Austin, which is where he also teaches. He has his PhD from Yale, and he taught there for some time before moving to UT Austin. And he is the author and editor of a handful of books. The most recent of those is The End of Ambition, The United States and the Third World in the Vietnam Era, which is the book that we talk about today. We start the conversation by talking about why his book focused on other foreign policy elements outside of Vietnam during the 60s. Obviously, when people think of U.S. foreign policy in the 60s, they think of Vietnam, LBJ's presidency, and how they handled Vietnam. And so, while there's been many books that have been written on that period, and Vietnam in particular, Mark wanted to put some of the emphasis on the other countries that were involved with foreign policy for LBJ's administration. We talk about the political opinions of communism, both on the left and the right at the time. We talk about how lower officials managed day-to-day foreign affairs policies. This was not necessarily just the top officials running everything. There and how the kind of hierarchy in U.S. Foreign policy was conducted. He talks about the use of the term "third world." We talk about transitions, transition from Eisenhower to JFK, what the style and governance was of JFK. We talk about the four strands of thinking on American foreign policy. And we talk about how Lyndon Johnson used the so-called Johnson treatment with foreign heads of state, much as he did with politicians here in the United States. And then we talk about, as he does in the book, kind of these 5 case studies. So these different countries that the Johnson administration was working with, while Vietnam was going on. So we talk about Brazil, India, Iran, Indonesia, and some of the countries in Southern Africa. We talk about the transition from LBJ's presidency and administration to Nixon, how there was differences, similarities, but how there was this continuity of just U.S. foreign affairs and what the policies were like. And, throughout the conversation, we talk about what this was like in the 60s, but then also, how this has ripple effects for how foreign affairs are conducted in the United States, even today, with some of the more recent administrations. And so this was a wonderful conversation. Mark is a treasure trove of knowledge and so much experience, teaching and researching this stuff on this period. And so now I bring you Mark Atwood Lawrence. I am here with Mark Atwood Lawrence. Mark, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I am greatly looking forward to talking to you about your book and your work that you've been doing.
Thank you so much, Xavier, for having me.
Yeah, of course. Tell listeners who you are and what you do, and then we can talk about the new book.
So my name is Mark Lawrence, and I teach, as I have for the past 20 years, in the history department at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm a specialist in American political and foreign relations history.
Yeah, that's great. This is your first book, or which book is this for you?
This is my third single author book. I've also edited a few, but
got it.
This is my third as the sole author of something I wrote cover to cover.
Yeah, no, that's great. The book is called The End of Ambition, The United States and the Third World in the Vietnam Era. It has a very sobering picture of LBJ in the front. So it's a great cover, actually, by the way. And I greatly enjoyed it, mostly because, as I was telling you, I'm a big fan of LBJ for many reasons. I mean, he obviously is a flawed man, but I'm a big fan of him politically. And, so obviously there's like the big series, right, by Caro. He's the big guy. He's the big giant in the field and all that. But I feel like a lot of folks talk about him in many ways, or when they talk about LBJ's foreign affairs, They always talk about Vietnam, and that's not even really mentioned that much in this book. It's mentioned obviously in context, and I thought that was nice. It's nice to see other aspects. Now, obviously, the book isn't about LBJ only, although he's featured, I guess, what, 2/3 or 3/4 of the book he's featured in it because of the time frame. But yeah, so I really appreciate that. I feel like his other ways of going about doing foreign affairs aren't highlighted. Vietnam is kind of the big shadow over all of it. So, any reason why you decided to write this book about his other, foreign affairs, kind of, I guess, in the late 50s to early 70s, or what was the reasoning for kind of writing the book?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Xavier. You've actually, just in the comments that you just delivered, captured some of my thinking that led directly to this project. So I've been focused as a historian on the history of the Vietnam War for the past 20 plus years, ever since the middle years of my PhD program. My first two books dealt squarely with the history of American engagement in Vietnam. So when it came time to pick a topic to write about for the next book in my career, I was interested in drawing on the body of knowledge that I had accumulated about Vietnam and about the Johnson presidency, and of course the Kennedy and Nixon presidencies as well. But I wanted to try to do something a little bit different that would stretch me in new directions. So the core question that increasingly intrigued me as I was looking around for something new to write about is, what was the effect of the Vietnam War, of this massive distraction in Southeast Asia, on the broader contours of American foreign policy? And so that's really the question that drove me across the years that it took me to research and write this book. I think we all understand Vietnam as this tragic episode in American foreign relations, but generally the focus has fallen, as is only natural, on the war itself. What I'm trying to do is put the war, as you nicely suggested, in the background and ask how it affected other relationships, other patterns of American behavior in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's important, right? When something is when there's a crisis, or when there's something really big that's going on, there are other things that are also going on that presidents or leaders or officials don't get credit for. And you could take any example from any of our most recent presidents that have, the one that comes to mind is Obama, who, granted, in 09, he was, worried about the economy not falling off the cliff and how to have better kind of rules and regulations for the financial system. But I mean, there's like a million things that he did that just don't get written about. How he tried to reform some of the judicial system, and how he was really amazing for energy, and some of the stuff he did for food and health. Like there's like unwritten things about some of the the bills Congress passed, but kind of his agenda and how he was able to do it. So that's just one example. But LBJ is also something, even in foreign affairs. And most people will say, well, domestically, he was, FDR's second coming, right? Medicaid, Medicare, civil rights, fair housing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what about foreign affairs? And so you kind of highlight some of the, that political savvy that he has, and, some of the shortcomings too in the book. So it's really, really good. So.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I think there's a lot to this idea that my book is just one of the periods that one could reasonably look at to examine how it is that a major crisis somewhere in the world distorts and alters, redirects policy toward other areas. And I think you're quite right in suggesting that recent times give us a classic example of this. The deep embroilments in Iraq and or Afghanistan are similar to Vietnam in the sense that, look, it's just one location in the world of secondary, maybe lower real importance to the United States, and yet they become the focus. Mm-hmm. And what are the effects? What are the costs in some ways of allowing one place of disputed importance to become the centerpiece that sucks all resources and political attention and public debate One of the reasons that my book has had a little bit of interest, I think, to people in the policy world is because of the echoes with that situation that has played out in very recent years.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that it's interesting. We'll get to it, but to just kind of seeing the different personalities and different ways in which the I guess the three major presidents that you mentioned in the book, how they do things differently, but also how there's like a constant US theme that doesn't really change, which is also interesting. So we'll get into it. But I guess let's start with something that you talked about in the beginning of the book, which is, my understanding, I was not alive in the 60s, so or the late 50s, so I can't speak to this experientially, but my reading of history, and I'll say this, I think it's a good resource. Maybe historians don't like it, but I thought the Ken Burns documentary on the Vietnam War was masterful. I really thought it was great. It's obviously not, a history textbook, but visually I thought it was pretty good.
Here. I agree.
But one of the things is that my understanding is that liberals and conservatives in the 60s, or late 50s and 60s, wanted to stop the spread of communism around the world. This was the evil empire. This was the villain. This was, and even still today, we see these ripples of like, you should be against communism and stuff for various reasons. But that was very potent at the time, it seems. Both parties were against this, maybe in different ways. And I think that was a sincere threat. I don't think that was like hyperbolic or that was just paranoia. Like there was a legitimate threat. If you see that. And so there was that whole like kind of domino effect, right? Like, oh man, it's here. Now it's spreading through all these countries in Asia. And now it's at our doorstep in Cuba, and it's down in South America. And it's like, there was a real danger here. How did it go from being, I guess, a real threat to then this kind of paranoia, whether you want to use that story to talk about the Cold War and then all the way up to the modern era? But how did we go from like, hey, this is a real thing to like, yeah, this is less of a real thing and we don't need to go and be the world's police and, beat down everyone's door and all that stuff? How does that mindset shift?
Different historians of the Cold War would answer that question in very different ways. My answer would really focus on the very late 1940s and early 1950s, when I think the Cold War underwent an important transformation. Up until, let's say, 1947, 1948, as the Cold War gathered steam, it was principally focused, the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were principally focused on Europe and, to some extent, Northeast Asia, Japan, above all. And let's face it, those were areas that really were of crucial, central significance to the United States, politically, economically, and in all sorts of other arenas, and where there was a significant, I would say, threat of political instability and communist inroads that significantly threatened core American national security interests. What happens in the very late 1940s and down through the early 1950s is that the Cold War sort of goes global. The tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, rooted in those places that I mentioned a moment ago, spread to other parts of the world, initially to the Middle East, to South Asia, ultimately to Latin America, to Africa, so that across the 1950s, certainly by the early 1960s, you can really speak of a global Cold War. And I think that it's in that process of the globalization of the Cold War that you can start to see what began as a very rational, sensible policy on Washington's part grows into something that was a little bit more detached from reality and had the potential to grow into a massive, never-ending drain on resources that really didn't correspond in any sensible way to the actual danger posed by communist expansion. And I think there are various reasons there are various explanations that account for that globalization of the Cold War and that tendency of something that began as a relatively rational response to particular geopolitical circumstances to grow into something that became somewhat more detached from reality. I think domestic political pressures have a lot to do with that in the American case. I think that the simple needs of a national security bureaucracy that was established in the early Cold War to rationalize its own existence is part of a good answer to that question
Mm.
um, uh, as well. There are all kinds of bureaucratic and economic pressures, I think, that help to account for the globalization of the Cold War.
One of the things that you mentioned early on, and I don't remember if it was in a particular administration or if it was just kind of a kind of a procedural thing, but you mentioned that there were lower level officials that had control in the day-to-day operations of many things for foreign affairs. I did not know that. I always joke with people that when we have to, vote for presidents or, there's an election coming up and people say, well, what about their foreign affairs? I'm like, me and you and no one else that's not in the Pentagon or the Situation Room really knows about foreign affairs, right? We're not getting that daily briefing. So everything we know about foreign affairs is always going to be a little bit removed. So I didn't know that lower level officials were kind of doing the day to day. I mean, I guess that makes intuitive sense, right? You're not going to have joint chiefs of staff and national security advisor and the president doing day to day operations, but it seems like that was important. How was that important during this era, and what were some of those differences that occurred between kind of the lower level officials and what they were doing? How much autonomy did they have? How much were their decisions kind of messing things up or not? Just talk about that kind of relationship.
Yeah, for sure. I think as the United States became this massively powerful country whose interests existed in every corner of the world, the management of foreign policy way exceeded the ability of any single individual or even a small collection of individuals to manage. And so inevitably, the bureaucracy had to become larger to cope with all the military and economic and strategic and cultural questions that arose in any number of parts of the world. And one of the consequences of that is that the day-to-day management of relationships that didn't rise to the level of urgency where they would command the president's attention tended to get managed lower in the bureaucracy. I mean, there are a lot of advantages to that. People
Sure.
with real expertise, real regional knowledge, have a stronger hand in the management of policy. The way I think about it, and I think this is important to my analysis in the book, is that presidents, by and large, set the direction, set the parameters for American foreign policy, and then, with the exception of a few issues that rise to the level of importance that they do command the president's attention, pretty much everything else falls to lower levels of the bureaucracy to implement. So in the cases that I look at in my book, for the most part, the day-to-day was managed by, not even the Secretary of State, right? Another layer or two lower in the bureaucracy. But presidents do pop up in my story from time to time because each one of the cases that I look at the heart of my book did every so often command the president's attention.
Was that something that kind of occurred during this period as a way of starting to do that? Had that already been occurring? And how much of that, I guess, persists even till today, right? You're talking about the country becoming very large, very powerful, very bureaucratic. Well, I mean, my goodness, I mean, that's still how it is, if not more so, in current day. So how much of that was already occurring? How much of this time period really kind of operationalized that? And how much of that now still exists in our modern day politics?
That's a great question. I mean, the long story here might take us back to the days of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, when the State Department consisted of a handful of individuals who dealt with the entire world as American history advances and the problems confronting the United States become more complex. The State Department, like other bureaucracies, of course, grows and grows. But the big growth came in the 20th century, and especially as a consequence of the Second World War. It's the Second World War that dramatically increased the size of the national security bureaucracy in an enduring way. And this is a really important point. So the War of 1898, the First World War, of course, had also produced expansions in the size of the American bureaucracy focused on national security. But when those wars were over, the bureaucracy shrank back down. What happens as a consequence, what happens during the Second World War is that a much larger bureaucracy than had ever been seen in American history before gets established, and then it remains the order of the day, even into peacetime. And of course, the Cold War had a lot to do with this. There was a general perception that even though the fighting was over, the United States still faced urgent national security problems. And so you needed a big military, a big diplomatic bureaucracy, and all the rest. So the modern American national security state, I think one could say, dates directly from the Second World War and the decisions made in 1946 and 1947 to preserve most of that bureaucracy, indeed to expand it in certain ways.
Yeah, it's. I think it's something that is super interesting, and it's an interesting thing to see how it evolves, through time and how it's continuing to evolve. Why did you use the term, excuse me, third world? Even though some people have retired it and use other things. Why was that? You talk about it in the book, so that's why I'm asking. Why did you decide to use that?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. There are definitely some problems with it. I think that one of the obvious problems is that it suggests that the parts of the world covered by that problematic label are third, right?
Yeah.
They are third in a list of three. The Western world,
Mm-hmm.
the communist world in second place, and the third world sort of comes in third. So there's a value judgment implicit in that. I think it's also problematic because it tends to lump different societies together on the basis of either their economic status or their racial status. And there's something very uncomfortable about that. So, people in Peru and people in Namibia and people in Laos are all presumed to be part of the same historical experience. And obviously that is profoundly problematic. But look, at the end of the day, I found that it was a very useful term for me, as have other historians working on the history of the Cold War in these regions of the world, because it really captures the way in which those parts of the world really were thought about by both the communist and the US-led blocs for much of the Cold War. They're problematic terms. It is a problematic term for sure, but it does capture the intellectual tendency of American officials, and I think the public more generally, to generalize about these parts of the world, to lump them together, to assume that they were up for grabs in some way in the competition between the communist and capitalist blocs. So what I try to emphasize in the introduction is that I use the term because it really captures something very real about the thinking that underpinned the Cold War.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you explained it, because it definitely caught my eye, and it was just like, oh, that's interesting. I haven't seen that word in a while, and it's like, I wonder why that was a phrase. But I think in context, it makes a lot of sense based on what was occurring. So let's move to, I guess, JFK. We don't spend a lot of time with JFK, mostly because I think he had a very short time in office, tragically so. But in the beginning, you kind of lay the groundwork for, kind of how he did things. And, obviously he was, very bright in one way, but he was also, wasn't the most experienced in another way, although he was well traveled. But in the beginning, when he kind of gets into office and you talk about his foreign affairs kinds of piece, was he just, he was obviously a good public speaker. He was obviously very charismatic. People loved him. Was he just rhetoric and no substance on foreign policy because of, ignorance? He just didn't know it, inexperience, he hadn't been in that high office, or was it just a kind of, well, let's just wait and see, let's see what happens kind of thing? I kind of give us his sort of demeanor towards foreign policy in the beginning. I mean, he talked a good game for sure. And he definitely had a very nice way of kind of selling things and how to explain things, which seems to be a problem for Democrats at the moment. But what can we make of that?
Sure. I think there was a lot of substance to and a lot of innovation at the heart of the way John F. Kennedy and his advisors managed American foreign policy. He's clearly someone who has lent himself to a lot of debate. I think there are people who see him as the quintessential flat-footed cold warrior who never met, a challenge he didn't back down from. On the other hand, there are people who think that he was really an innovator, who, especially in a second term, had he lived, would have reoriented American foreign policy in really significant ways. Someone who thought very critically about what was taking place in the world, especially in terms of the socioeconomic revolution ongoing in the global South, in the third world, if you like. Mm-hmm. And if given the chance, really could have brought some of his insights to bear in the actual making of policy. My own view is this, and this is what I try to work out in the first couple of chapters of the book. I think that JFK, much more so than any other Cold War president, really did have a feel for the socioeconomic transformation that much of the world was undergoing in the 1950s and 1960s. He understood many of the complexities of decolonization and the profound questions about distribution of power and resources that went with decolonization in many of these newly emerging countries. And he believed very strongly that the United States needed to adapt its policies to swim with rather than against what he saw as the inevitable tide of history. Americans, in short, needed to find a way to cooperate with and to harness, to some extent, these profound transformations that were going on in many, many parts of the world. And of course, his fear was that if the United States didn't do it and didn't do it well, the communists would be the ultimate beneficiaries. So this all was tied up for sure in the logic of the Cold War, but I also think it reflected a relatively deep degree of thinking about what it was that was really going on in these societies and an ability to think beyond the Cold War cliches. But that said, JFK operated as a very successful politician in the real world of America in the late 1950s and early 1960s. He understood that you could only go so far in reorienting American policy in a way that would have exposed him to criticism for being weak on communists or, not sufficiently vigorous and standing up to the communist menace and so forth. So I think he had to proceed very carefully, and he had to listen to advice from advisors who had different approaches to the Cold War and understood fundamentally what was happening around the world in different ways. So I think that JFK is best understood at the end of the day as a pragmatist who listened to a wide range of advice, who wanted to operate on the basis of real insight into what was going on fundamentally around the world, but sometimes felt himself constrained by public opinion, by the expectations of allies and so forth, to behave in ways that were more quintessentially Cold Warrior in that sort of Truman and Eisenhower way. So I think one of the problems with coming to terms with JFK is that you can find evidence for almost any generalization you want to advance about JFK. If you want to hold him up as the quintessential Cold Warrior, you can find evidence for that, and particularly in his rhetoric. If you want to make the case that, look, here's someone who was actually thinking in very creative and innovative ways about the need to reorient American foreign policy, you can also find that. And what I try to do is get away from this idea that there was a real JFK. So one of these is real and the other was JFK just posturing in some way. And I suggest that really he was all of these things. He was listening to advisors with different points of view, and depending on the domestic political pressures, depending on what was in the headlines on a given day and so forth, he made different choices, fundamentally different choices in response to different problems that he faced.
I want to come back to the idea of debate in the administration, but before that, just a quick question. When you were talking there was, obviously there was a pretty big, this happens often sometimes in American politics, but there was such a big difference between, I guess you could say, in terms of style and or party and things like that. But, Eisenhower was I think he's one of the most underrated presidents for sure. And he was a great general, and he was, 8 years of peace and all these things. And JFK was very much the opposite in some ways in terms of age and party and, all these things. What was that kind of transition like? Just real briefly, just what was that transition like from someone like that, 8 years, to this very young, some people said inexperienced, too Catholic, all the criticisms. What was that, I guess, that transition like in terms of the foreign affairs piece of things? Because, I think there's a certain safety of having the general taking care of it, all of these things. And then this person that doesn't have any of that kind of experience.
Yeah. To the naked eye, I think exactly as you suggest, these were two profoundly different men, very different experiences. They struck very different tones on the campaign trail. Mm-hmm. Eisenhower was that sort of avuncular, low-key figure. JFK was the man of pay any price, bear any burden, activism all around the world, mm-hmm. all the time. My own view is that a lot of that difference has to do with domestic politics, has to do with what was necessary for JFK to say in order to appeal politically in 1960. If you look at the actual behavior of Eisenhower and Kennedy, I think you see a remarkable degree of continuity. And I think this is often the case when the presidency passes from one party to another. The rhetoric leads us to think that there's night and day difference. Mm-hmm. But in fact, if you stand back and then benefit from the passage of time, you can see all kinds of continuities. Mm-hmm. So I think Eisenhower was cautious in his management of American foreign policy. And despite the rhetoric, I would argue that JFK was also very cautious. What does he do in Cuba? He chooses not to confront the Soviets militarily. What does he do in Berlin? He chooses not to confront the Berlin Wall, not to confront the Soviets directly. What does he do in Laos? Despite the advice of Dwight Eisenhower, he negotiates an agreement. What does he do in Vietnam? He does not insert American ground forces when he had that opportunity in 1961. So there's a quite striking degree of continuity, I think, here that, again, the rhetoric can suggest something that's quite at odds with the actual practice.
Yeah, and I think, again, I don't want to do it too much, but I think it is helpful just for listeners that there is some of that still has ripple effects now and how we, some things just don't change, right? In terms of, United States, foreign policy and things like that. So back to the whole thing about JFK in terms of his administration. In the book, he mentioned this, and I've read this elsewhere, that, he was very much concerned with debate, right? He wanted people to debate and, give different opinions and viewpoints. And I definitely think Obama kind of fostered that. I think Biden fosters that. It's a style. It's kind of a sense of style. But my reading of this for JFK and maybe some of the modern presidents I just named is that maybe sometimes there was too many voices, right? There's too much debate. There was too much kind of, I don't want to say navel gazing, but there was just too intellectualized, and at some point, that could be counterproductive and you got to take some action at some point, or you can overthink things. How much do you think, did he get that balance right as far as we know, or what's your kind of read on that?
I think that's a legitimate critique. And I even quote a couple of JFK advisors who said as much in their oral histories or memoirs from later years. It was too much of an intellectual free-for-all to the point where it was sometimes hard to know what the core of the policy was meant to be. As you suggest, there are presidents, including in the last 50 years, who proceeded very differently. I would hold up George W. Bush, probably LBJ, as classic examples of presidents who had a very, very small circle of advisors. Yeah. And I think we can see all sorts of downsides to the decisions that came from those presidencies for a whole different set of reasons. So I guess the question is there sort of a middle ground where, you can have enough a set of principles
Hmm.
that guide policy. I think probably the administrations like JFK's, I would put Ronald Reagan's in this camp as well, FDR's, that did encourage a kind of free-for-all, have been better for the country than those that have tightly constrained decision-making at the
Hmm.
very top,
Hmm. Yeah, yeah,
despite their drawbacks.
yeah. I would definitely agree with that. There was something you put in the beginning of the book, and again, I'll say, the book kind of is interesting because it's basically there's a big kind of introduction preamble of setting the stage in the first, I guess, 3-ish chapters, and then there's like individual chapters for the 5 countries, and then a nice concluding chapter. So the book flows really nice. In the beginning, you talk about these 4 strands of thinking: globalist, nation building, strong point, unilateralism, that were really important to American foreign affairs. And so I think that might actually be really helpful to just go over those, because it definitely sets up the stage for LBJ and some of his dissenters, and then for Nixon, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about how that continues just kind of through time, even till today, with American foreign policy. So maybe give us the overview of the 4 strands of thinking there.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much for asking about this. I'm really drawn to this idea of seeing policymaking as a negotiation, as a debate almost, among people with different intellectual outlooks. It works better, I think, for some presidencies than others for reasons that we've already touched on. Some administrations are set up to encourage this kind of thing, whereas others are not so much. But I think that this kind of approach does have value, regardless of what policy question or period you're talking about. But as you say in the book, early on, I identify 4 major currents of thinking that ran, I think, very powerfully through the Kennedy administration. One, as you mentioned, was what I call the globalist outlook. These were sort of quintessential New Deal liberals who believed very powerfully in multilateralism. They believed that international affairs should be conducted on the strength of multilateral combinations of countries working together to pool resources. They were also strong advocates of independence, of decolonization, and believed that those new nations that emerged from colonialism should be folded relatively quickly into the community of nations. The second group were what I call nation builders, who also were major proponents of decolonization. They believed that a profoundly important historical process was playing out in the 20th century. Nations were coming to replace colonial empires. They emphasized, though, the autonomy, the distinctiveness of those individual states, and believed that the United States had an important role to play in cultivating the development of core national institutions. They were much less drawn to multilateralism. Rather, they believed that the business of the United States should be to foster the development of nations on capitalist and democratic principles that would over time evolve into something kind of like the United States. Mm-hmm. Let's see, the third strand of thought that I identify is what I call the strong points way of thinking. And what I'm trying to get at here is that policymakers of this persuasion believed that the United States, while recognizing the importance of decolonization and the profound change in human history that it represented, needed to preserve nonetheless an ability to prioritize pretty rigorously among parts of the world that were important to the United States and parts of the world that were not important to the United States. At the heart of this was a recognition that American resources were limited. And so at the end of the day, the United States needed to be able to say, well, Japan and India and Europe and perhaps others belong on that list. These were areas of real importance, but sub-Saharan Africa, not so much. So why get deeply involved in those places? Why pump resources into those places when American interests are really not directly at stake in those areas? And then I also talk about unilateralists. This is an attitude most prevalent, I'd say, in the intelligence world and in the military, where the emphasis is on immediate applications of American power, whether it's covert operations or military force, to achieve relatively blunt and quick changes in uh, overseas political alignments in a way that would serve American interests. So, as I mentioned in the book, this is the one of these four currents of thought that really lies outside the liberal consensus that sought to use American power in subtler ways. But the fact of the matter is that people who advocated this approach always had a seat at the table. It was always part of policymaking discussions, and occasionally this was a school of thought that actually did. Control the policies that resulted from the policymaking process. So it's important to put, I think, alongside the others.
Mm-hmm. It seems, and I could get this wrong, I believe JFK was the globalist. Is this correct?
I think his instincts ran more strongly in that direction than any of the others. But I, at the end of the day, see him as someone whose role was kind of to negotiate among the four strands of thought that swirled in his decision-making world. So when he sat around tables with his advisors, all four of these schools of thought, I think, were represented to different degrees. And he made decisions from time to time that ran in each of these directions. You know, look at the Bay of Pigs, right? Talk about a unilateralist kind of approach. And of course, that came very early in his administration, and there are complicated reasons why it may not have reflected core approaches to foreign policy represented by JFK. But it's a good example of Kennedy of a particular type of Kennedy foreign policy. It's also, we can certainly talk about this, relatively easy to think of instances where he chose to operate on the basis of globalist or unilateral or nation building and so forth impulses.
As LBJ has a different kind of stance. He's the strong point. Am I right on this? Or where does he kind of fall on this? I mean, again, I'm not trying to make it a, false dichotomy of sorts. I mean, there's some value maybe in all of them, but where's the one that he leans on the most, I guess?
Yeah, I think that if Kennedy was flexible, but instinctively leaned toward the globalist approach, LBJ really didn't have much time for the globalists. Yeah. And leaned himself toward the nation-building approach. He wanted to establish strong nations in the wake of colonialism that would ally with the United States and have strong institutions, especially national security institutions, that could cooperate with the United States.
And I guess just kind of moving, just kind of taking a glimpse in the future, as we kind of go through it, where do we put Nixon in this kind of mold? And then I would say maybe Reagan. Where do you kind of see these two presidents sitting here?
I think Nixon and his always important foreign policy lieutenant Henry Kissinger were very similar to LBJ. And this is one of the continuities that I really try to tease out in the book. And this speaks to something we were talking about a few minutes ago. We tend to think of these moments in American political history where presidential power swings from one party to the other as the most important breaking points. But in 1968, I think you can see that they were, LBJ and Nixon were in many ways on the same page in terms of foreign policy. The real distinction was more from Kennedy to LBJ. But I think that Nixon prioritized what I call in the book both the strong point and the nation building approach. I think to the extent he wanted to think about the problems of the third world, he believed, like LBJ, in the need to establish strong, robust, pro-Western nations in the wake of colonialism. But I think, and here maybe there's a difference of degree with LBJ, he also wanted to very much lower the temperature in the third world and lower the place of third world problems in American policymaking so that he could focus on revitalizing the relationship with Western Europe, and above all, so that he could transform the relationships with the Soviet Union and China. And of course, he succeeded in at least revitalizing or uh, uh, re- renovating the relationship with the two communist superpowers, and I think he's probably deservedly known for that accomplishment.
And where do you see, I guess, Reagan? Obviously he was, pretty influential in foreign affairs. Where do you see this, and then how do you see any similarities or differences between, Bush Senior and Bush Junior?
One of the things that really struck me as I got further into studying American policymaking in the Kennedy period is how similar in many ways Ronald Reagan and JFK were and are. It's not a comparison that I think springs readily to mind. One is the archetypal liberal Democrat, the other is the pioneer of modern conservatism. But I think in the realm of foreign policy, there's a lot to this idea. I think their decision-making style, as I mentioned a while ago, is very similar. They both liked debate almost to the point of chaos. And in each case, the actual record of decision-making reflects different currents at different times. So Reagan could be the man who sends the Marines into Grenada, but also the man who pulls the Marines out of Lebanon, right? The man who spoke of revitalizing the American ability to use power internationally, and yet really didn't use American power all that boldly,
right,
very much of the time at all. Seems to have recognized the limits on his ability to use power. So I think there are a lot of interesting comparisons to JFK, not least this ability to use rhetoric in a way that suggested something very different from what the actual practice of policymaking was.
And with Bush Senior and Bush Junior, how do you kind of see them? Do you see them as similar? I mean, I know they're related, but they're obviously different people in different times, and obviously there's the first war in the early 90s with Bush Senior, and then there's Iraq again, and then Afghanistan. How do you? I mean, I think most people would say, I mean, maybe it's too early, it's too close, but most people would say, Bush Junior definitely was a kind of nation building type of stance. I don't know if you could make the same case for Bush Senior. It was a different time, but
it's true. Bush Senior, George H.W. Bush. If I had to use my scheme, I suppose I would say he was a strong point guy. He was someone who really stands out for his ability to prioritize, to know what's important, what's less important. This is a habit of mind, I think, that is often associated with what political scientists sometimes call realism. And George H.W. Bush is sometimes held up as the most realist of American policymakers, among presidents at least, in recent times. And I think that's probably right. He was someone who understood the need to be cautious and to be restrained on certain issues. I think many of the decisions for which he is reasonably praised had to do with his ability to stand back, right? Not to dance on the Berlin Wall, to take just one example, right? But to let history take its course, to defend American interests, but also not to be hyperactive in asserting American power when things seem to be going strongly in the American direction. I think younger Bush is very much like LBJ in a lot of ways, right? Very small circle of advisors, someone who overreacted to problems in what I'll broadly call the third world and got himself into a world of trouble in a war of choice that came, unfortunately for him, to define his legacy.
Yeah. Well, I won't ask you about Obama, Trump, or Biden because it's way too soon. Historians, you guys like, 30, 40 years of time and distance, but you could definitely see some of that too. The Obama doctrine is very fascinating. Obviously, Trump was the wild card there. And of course, Biden is still at the moment, figuring things out. So it'll be interesting to see where they all kind of land.
I think there is a certain way in which my book echoes recent times. What I do in the book is to, as I've already mentioned, look at how the American preoccupation in one particular location destroys the ambition,
Hmm.
destroys the ability to be constructive in other parts of the world, and leads to a retrenchment that played out in the late 1960s and across the 1970s. And I think, broadly speaking, we've seen something very similar. So during 2003, 2004, George W. Bush speaks in hyper ambitious terms, uses an ambitious kind of rhetoric about American foreign policy that really did echo the rhetoric of a JFK or a Ronald Reagan. Um, and then that falls apart pretty quickly. The Bush
Hmm.
Doctrine gives way to a long period of retrenchment in which Americans lose a lot of that ambition that had briefly been so central to the way Americans talked about foreign policy as a consequence, I think, above all of 9/11. And so, we'll see where we stand on all this in another 20 or 30 years.
Hmm.
But I think
Hmm.
it's not unreasonable to think of Obama and Trump, different though they may be, as presidents who really had to manage this retreat, if I can
Yeah.
put it that way, or this retrenchment from the excessive ambitions of
Hmm.
2002, 2003, 2004.
Well, and kind of how it was, it kind of hamstring both of them in what they were able to do. Um, you saw a pivot that Obama made to Asia late in second term of Obama, and then also with the ways in which he tried to deal with Iran, which is controversial, and how he went back on the red line with Syria, and then dealing with Cuba, and he was trying to figure out kind of this, as is true to Obama's nature, this pragmatic way of dealing with strong leaders, with this shadow and still problematic thing of Afghanistan and Iraq, right? And Trump, in his way, I think the most charitable reading of that is he tried to do it in his way of that, which was, I don't think he wanted to be in Afghanistan or Iraq either. He said in his campaign he didn't want to. And how do I deal with strong leaders in the world? How do I deal with North Korea? How do I deal with the leader in Brazil and other folks? So, but they have these other things that are kind of what you're saying, that kind of overreach from the Bush years, and that kind of just put that shadow over it. So it's interesting.
Yeah, exactly. It's remarkable, right, that we had to pivot to Asia when I think, if the proverbial Martian landed in the United States in around that moment, the Martian would have said, of course, China is your number one concern or problem. It's remarkable that you have to pivot from a part of the world that is obviously less important and focus on the thing that is really important. There's a strong echo there of what I'm
It's within 60, 70 years, there's this almost like this accordion effect of what's going on. It's very, very strange. And, historians 50 years from now are, going to have a field day trying to write about how that's worked. Yeah. Again, moving towards the middle part of the book, you kind of give a chapter where you set up kind of all of the different countries you discuss. And so maybe we'll spend more time with some than others, but you talk about Brazil, India, Iran, Indonesia, and Southern Africa, I believe. And so I believe with Brazil and India, there's a lot of similarities there. Is that right? Or maybe it's India and Iran. I can't quite remember, but there's this idea of, at least with India and maybe Indonesia, that they were anti-colonial, this non-alignment stance. How did those two countries, just in a general kind of overview, how did they work at this time frame during the 60s of interactions with the U.S., knowing, back half of the 60s, Vietnam was going on, not too far away from them?
Yeah, for sure. This American fear of non-alignment, that these newly emerging nations of the third world would slip away from the United States or even gravitate toward the communist bloc, was a nightmare scenario for Americans. And that fear really runs in many ways through each of my case studies that you just listed. Mm-hmm. I think it ran especially powerfully to take the first of the cases I look at in Brazil, where no less than a loyal pro-American nation in the Western Hemisphere was starting in the late 1950s and early 1960s to show some tendencies toward dropping out of the American-led geostrategic order. Mm-hmm. This was a particular nightmare scenario for Americans because of the fact that Brazil was in the Western Hemisphere at the end of the day. And since James Monroe in 1823, Americans had made pretty clear that the Western Hemisphere was an arena of American dominance. So it's one thing for a country like Indonesia or India to, drift out of the American orbit. That, not to say that wasn't problematic, but the urgency of the problem, I think, was particularly great if it was in the Western Hemisphere because of the geopolitical consequences, but also in some ways because of the domestic political consequences. It would not have sat well with the American public to see a country like Brazil tumble out of an American-led international system. So I think for that reason, Kennedy and, of course, LBJ as well were particularly anxious about what was happening so close by.
Well, I want to give, some of those time of their own, but before we do that, we can just kind of set up with LBJ. So obviously, most people know the story about, JFK being assassinated and LBJ taking over. And there was obviously it was a big, a tragedy, a big shock to the country and to the world. It seems like in the beginning, LBJ wanted to focus on domestic issues, maybe because, I think, was it that he kind of knew foreign affairs wasn't his strength? And, he was House Majority Leader for 12 years. Am I wrong on that? Maybe it's too long. But he was House Majority Leader.
Senate Majority.
Excuse me. Senate Majority Leader. He just knew how to do that. I still don't think there's been anybody that's been that, exquisite at managing political kind of races there to do that. And so maybe he thought he could do a win. A lot of people will credit him for getting civil rights across the finish line, especially now, granted, activism and many of the civil rights leaders were a huge part. So I'm not giving LBJ a lot of credit there. But, especially when you look at his voting record up until the 1957 Civil Rights, 58, whatever it was, Civil Rights Act. He voted against it for as long as he had been in the Senate. So, it's incredible, his whole political acumen. But did he focus on domestic issues because he just didn't know enough about foreign affairs? He didn't care about. He knew it was kind of weaker. He knew he could get some wins. Kind of using some of the political capital he had at the moment. How do you understand that?
Yeah, I think it's going too far to say that LBJ was ignorant of the wider world or way out of his element. I think sometimes those claims have been made, but let's face it, this is a guy who, was in Congress for the crucial years of the Second World War, the early Cold War, was at many points deeply involved in decision-making on crucial matters of national security. He was on the House Naval Affairs Committee and then on the Senate Armed Services Committee. So he did know these issues. But what I would suggest is two other things, which I think are ultimately more interesting than an argument about ignorance. One is that he always, from the earliest days of his political career, was most anchored in domestic policy issues. He was a New Dealer. That was his persona as a politician, and it remained his persona, I think, though he taxed a little bit with the political winds through the 1940s and 1950s. That really remains fundamental to his identity as a politician. His ability to bring the goods back to the people of Texas or to the Hill Country was his bread and butter, and that's where he wanted it to be. I don't think he regretted that. That really played to his strengths.
I think one of the things you mentioned early on, and this will lead us right up to the kind of case studies, if you will, is there's you make this really, I thought it was a convincing argument, which was he had his way of using the presidency was, I think you say that JFK was transformative and he was non-transformative, right? But that LBJ's trust in strong leaders, elites, and a central government was how he chose to manage this. And particularly his use of strong leaders seems to be promoting that nation building strand as opposed to the more globalist one. And so tell us about why that was his method. Why did he choose or did he choose? He just kind of fall into it. That approach of saying, well, you got some authoritarians or some strong men here. We'll just use it. We'll play the political arm here and we'll just go with it instead of trying to, shift or focus. Was this a pragmatic approach, or kind of walk us through what his mindset was?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating subject. I think that sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. LBJ came of age politically in an era when decisions got made by powerful men who knew each other, who sat across the table from one another, who had a drink together, who smoked a cigar together, who maneuvered in that world of the proverbial, in that proverbial smoke-filled room. That was politics as LBJ understood it, I think, and largely lived it in the 1930s and 1940s. I think that American politics undergoes an important transformation. Where exactly to date it is an interesting question, but the public becomes much more engaged. Matters of public perception and persona become much more important. Television clearly has a lot to do with this. Yeah. So I think it was just in LBJ's DNA that you solved problems by figuring out who it is who you could sit across the table from and cut a deal. Whereas JFK was a different sort of character, much more diffident, much more aloof, much more educated in a sort of straightforward sense of literally reading books about places far from American shores and visiting them routinely across his earlier life. So JFK, I think you could say, developed a much more complicated idea of how problems needed to get solved. It wasn't enough just to sit across the table from the Shah or from any of the other, national leaders whom I write about. One had to actually understand what was happening at a sort of grassroots level in these foreign societies. It's an important distinction, and I think even though Kennedy preceded LBJ as president, they are embodiments of a very different style of politics, and in a certain way of foreign policy making as well. Kennedy prefiguring what would come in later years, and LBJ being in some ways the last of the New Dealers, the last of those politicians who maneuvered in smoke-filled rooms and believed that was the way to get things done.
Yeah, I would say kind of a modern example of this was Clinton. Clinton had a version of this in the 90s, especially first term Clinton. And many people, give Obama a lot of grief about the fact that he didn't do that. It's like, hey, man, like, you're trying to get healthcare passed. You're trying to get your laws passed. Or you're trying to get this, resolution. Like, you gotta get in there and, just throw a party and, go have some drinks with the Senate, whomever, and that's not him. He was very much that kind of cerebral, professorial, intellectual kind of person, which, I think is interesting how there are external pressures of how, the Senate in particular is always old, right? You're always having, when it was, in LBJ's time, you just had people there from before the New Deal that were still there, that were 80 years old. The Senate's always old. And so it's one of those things where it's like, people push for that and say, look, we got to get this done. And I would say, yes, LBJ was probably one of the last folks to be like that. I mean, Clinton had elements of it, but it seems that was the case. And so it does seem like he just kind of took that style of what he was good at, and he could. What did they call you? Give you the full Lyndon effect or whatever it was.
Oh, yeah,
the full Lyndon Johnson
treatment.
The Johnson treatment.
The Johnson treatment. Yep.
Right. Get you real close. Hand on the shoulder. Back. The whole thing. Right. And he just kind of applied that with foreign affairs. Is basically kind of what he did, which is interesting. for a variety of reasons. For me specifically, is because there's the United States political apparatus and how that works and how we have our own culture here, especially at that time. And he was, that was his house, although there is that kind of sobering period for him where he was VP and he really just felt kind of lost, kind of lost, kind of politically. But there's that piece of it. But then, how do you understand? Well, okay, that's what he was familiar with, but now he's just trying to apply that to literally people from around the world, different cultures, different language, different norms, that's not always going to translate the same way, which is a different kind of challenge. So it's interesting he chose, or leaned into, I should say, I guess, that kind of style of handling kind of foreign affairs. Yeah. And,
I think at the end of the day, I would be comfortable with the idea that that's simply just what he knew. It was inconceivable, really, to approach the challenges of diplomacy in a different way. He always wanted to know who the most powerful person was and how best to negotiate with those people to get what he believed would serve American interests. He was never really able, I think, to break out of that mindset. There's a quote about LBJ that I use in the book. Honestly, I forget the source of the quote, but nevertheless, the point is that Lyndon Johnson was a man of Washington, not of the nation. So this is a comment that's concerned with describing his approach to domestic policy, but something analogous, I think, could be said about his approach to foreign policy. He was a man who believed that powerful people could come together in specific locations and negotiate with each other. He didn't have a particularly good read for the general will, for opinion out among the masses, whether that was within the United States or even more complicated for him would have been the international scene. And I think you can, if you look at his career, you can see how much time he spent in Washington and how much reward he got in personal terms and also in political terms from being that master lever puller who always knew where to go to get a deal done. But how well did he understand what was happening at a more fundamental level within the nation or internationally? I think this was his Achilles heel as a politician. You can see it, I think, very strongly in the domestic arena as his presidency advances and protest movements and urban unrest start to become the major problems confronting him. He really doesn't get it. He doesn't understand what's driving those people. And his mind goes to really simplistic judgments about, the communists are behind it, or, someone's out to get me, or, my political opponents are trying to do me in. And clearly it was about a whole lot more than that, but it's revealing that he didn't have a particularly good feel, I think, for what I'll broadly call the public mood, or what people were thinking at the grassroots.
Yeah, he doesn't seem like he had a really good pulse of the social kind of climate at the time. And absolutely. I mean, my goodness, the 60s was tense. But he definitely had a pulse on Washington. Yeah. And, you definitely need that. I mean, you need both. And I don't know if one person has to be able to do both, but you definitely need both. And, so he definitely did one version of that. Okay, so moving kind of to some of the countries here, we'll see how many we can get to. Sure. We'll start with Brazil. Just a few questions on Brazil. I mean, there's many things you could ask about this, but I guess for Brazil, a main question I have here was, and you can set it up the context if you want, but Costa e Silva was the president at the time during LBJ's period in the office, and why, I guess the main question is twofold, is, why was he tolerant of this authoritarian right-wing leader? And why did he decide to engage with them economically and not in other, or primarily with economic aid, as opposed to maybe other ways of engagement?
So in Brazil, long story short, there was a coup in April of 1964 that put an end to this chaotic situation that seemed, at least to American observers, to be drifting out of the American orbit and maybe even into the communist orbit. So the military takes the lead in this coup in April of 1964, and suddenly there's a very different political reality in Brazil that would, over the years, consolidate into a really harsh military regime. And the story I really try to tell in the book is how the Johnson administration came to terms month by month, year by year, with an increasingly repressive political order. So the American attitude toward a leader like Costa Silva, as you mentioned, is really central to my story. And I think that what my story tells is of an American awareness of the awkwardness of being allied with or in bed with these pretty brutal characters who really don't sit well with the American self-conception of championing democracy and, creating opportunity for the little guy and so forth. But Americans also recognize that the military was much better than the alternative and delivered the goods when it came to a strongly pro-American geopolitical orientation, service to American economic ambitions in the world. So in short, the brutality of the regime was a price worth paying for American officials. And every time the Brazilian regime tightened the screws, cracked down a little bit more, Americans were repelled at one level, but very quickly, I think, came to terms with what they were seeing in Brazil in recognition of the fact, as they saw it, that these were prices worth paying for a country that would cater to American interests.
Yeah, how much of a threat was there, or an actual threat or perceived threat of communism kind of getting its hands on Brazil, especially when you have a lot of unrest? You have a certain type of a leader, and then you have a coup, and it's right there in our backyard, and it's at the height of the 60s, and how much of that was trying to kind of hold that at bay, offset it, make sure hey, let's not poke the bear here and let this and again, the history of Brazil is very interesting and dynamic in its own ways for its own history, and then how it made that climb up to where it's at now as what we would call an emerging economy now. I think it's it's the seventh or eighth largest economy in the world, something like that, or it was at one point. So, there was definitely a trajectory that Brazil had on its own, but at the time in the 60s, how much of that was trying to hold that kind of ideology at bay?
Yeah, I think there was a recognition then as now that Brazil is the biggest dog in the neighborhood, the biggest population, the massive natural resources, real potential that many of its neighbors don't quite have. So Brazil is the most important country in the region, and I think that helps explain why Americans attach so much importance to Brazil and behaved as they did. It's an interesting question of what actually would have happened if events had continued to unfold without a coup. What might Brazil have looked like if it had continued down the path of this sort of leftward orientation? There were plenty of American policymakers who said, it would have been the second fall of China. This would have been like this massive catastrophe for Western interests in the Cold War. I don't know. It seems to me it would have looked more like what happened in Chile later on, or in a few other countries around the hemisphere that had these periods of leftward reorientation, Nicaragua, Cuba. One has to kind of multiply, I suppose, by a power of 10 because Brazil is such a major country.
Yes.
But, it seems to me there would have been a lot of political and economic chaos, but whether the sort of nightmare scenarios in geopolitical terms that American leaders imagined would have come to pass, I think is a very different question.
Yeah, I see it as, it's interesting. This is a slight rabbit trail, but I think what happens in many Latin American countries is there's a type of loop that occurs where there will be significant problems such as extreme poverty, crime, poor economics, even for quote unquote middle class folks, etc. Damage of natural resources, many problems, many sincere problems. Poverty being the probably top of the list there, and the leftward pull is enticing, and I think maybe sometimes a brand of it might be helpful for a time. I think you need a kind of shock, and it's not sustainable long term. But my reading of this, both from family I have in Latin America, my reading of Latin America, etc., is folks down in Latin America become pretty motivated by a figure, and that's it. When the figure's gone, then the rest of the movement kind of dies off. Or it's the figure and that's it. And so then they just put all of it into the one person. And it's not much about a party. There's no political infrastructure. And it's all about these big figures. And then they run it. And when they don't run it anymore, it falls apart. And then you have the same problems that are there. That's one reading I have of it. And I wonder if Brazil's different. In some ways, so in terms of many things, culturally and size and population and economy and resources, and the Amazon is major there, and many things. But I wonder if it would just be like that, this kind of loop of these types of leaders, big charismatic folks, making a lot of promises, maybe delivering on some of them, but not letting it go. And I think it's complicated. It's a complicated situation because of the severity of the problems there.
Right.
People just need the immediacy of the change, and they don't really care. And, and then you get some pretty bad faith actors there, and so on and so forth. So.
Right. And the American fear, of course, was that a leftist government in a country like Brazil, even if they wanted nothing particular to do with the Soviet Union or didn't really embrace communism in any ideological sense, nevertheless would have seen the attractions of getting support from the Soviet Union, opening diplomatic missions from the Soviet Union, increasing economic ties to the Soviet Union. And then you can also insert Cuba for where I've just mentioned Soviet Union and see a whole different or related but different set of problems connected to Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. So the fear, of course, was that these areas would become outposts of and bastions of strength for either Cuba or the Soviet Union, or conceivably both.
The interesting thing about that is that still happens today. We just have many Latin American countries aligning with China economically, because China will pour into the economics of a Latin American country. I mean, doing some great stuff. I mean, in terms of building infrastructure, in terms of bridges and roads and buildings, things these countries desperately need. And then there's an alliance with them there. And so, it's a kind of, scratch your back, you scratch mine kind of thing. And they're aligning more with China for many reasons than with Canada, United States, Europe, etc. So, and that's how it's happening in Africa as well. So it's interesting how it's less ideologically positioned and more economically positioned, but still, you can see some similarities, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving to India, how much for India? They seem to be aligned with Soviet Union and Pakistan, and how much did that kind of get in the way of what LBJ was trying to do? He kind of was getting blocked by these other two powers, and so they also lean on economic aid to India, even though there's these alliances with these other countries. So how did LBJ try to again lean on the economics side of it and try to navigate or compete with some of these other big powerhouses?
Yeah. Starting with Kennedy, Americans wanted nothing more than India to become a close partner, not ally, but partner of the United States. And it made perfect sense. It was the world's biggest democracy aligning with the most powerful democracy. It seemed like a match made in heaven. But what consistently defeated American ambitions, I think, were two things. One was an underestimation of Indian attachment to the principle of non-alignment. After so many years of colonial rule, Indians wanted nothing to do with attaching themselves to another major power. And the American ambitions in India were also defeated by the incredibly complicated regional politics, which ultimately mattered more, I think you could say, to the Indians than the broader logic of the Cold War that Americans prioritized above everything else. And above all, what I'm getting at here is the very complicated relationship between India and Pakistan.
Right.
So Americans desperately wanted India and Pakistan to bury the hatchet and to line up alongside each other, alongside the West in the Cold War. But Indians and Pakistanis had this, of course, longstanding tension with each other and consistently prioritize their antagonism alongside the larger Cold War. So it's a source of endless frustration for the United States.
Yeah, and that tension still persists today. I mean, and I think there's a lot of history there, geopolitical stuff, and then I think maybe some of the various cultural components. I mean, they're both terribly diverse, but they have a mixture of history, and it's just it's a complicated relationship.
Sure.
I guess this kind of, just tell us about this, because you talk about it in the book, and I think it's important. What was the biggest impact that Indira Gandhi? She was the prime minister, right? Prime minister, right? Had on relations with the U.S., and then how did that appear to sour later on towards the end of LBJ's presidency, and what were the reasons for how it fractured? So just kind of talk about that kind of dynamic.
Yeah, for sure. The high point of U.S.-Indian relations in the 1960s came in 1962 when India fought a border war against the Chinese. And this was a kind of made-to-order golden opportunity for the United States because India desperately needed outside help, including military assistance, and the Kennedy administration rides to the rescue. And American policymakers who really hoped for a whole new era of U.S.-Indian cooperation thought that this could be the start of exactly what they hoped to achieve. But what happens year after year after year thereafter is that American ambitions come to little. And I think that there are a number of broad explanations. The persistence of the tension with Pakistan is certainly one of those problems. Americans are consistently frustrated by the unwillingness of Indira Gandhi or other Indian leaders to put that tension on the back burner and prioritize what Americans always thought should be the main show. Indian dependence on American economic aid, I think it's also clear, was a source of tension between the two countries. Somewhat paradoxically, right? You would think that American aid for India would have cemented a close relationship, right. But in fact, the way copious American aid, especially including food aid at a moment of famine in India, played out was to exacerbate tensions. A sense grew up in India that that their country is becoming too dependent on American largesse, and that Americans were manipulating that aid to force changes in Indian foreign policy. So, again, in a strange roundabout way, American aid that flowed in such massive amounts became a problem. And related to that was another variable that I would point out, which was the shift across the 1960s in Indian public opinion. In a book like mine that's focused on decision-making at the highest levels, it can sometimes be easy to lose track of these very important political transformations that are playing out in any of these societies. But it's certainly fair to say that Indira Gandhi faced a very different electorate at the end of the decade than she or other Indian leaders had faced in the earlier, maybe even middle parts of the decade. The public opinion shifts to the left in a strongly anti-American direction, and it created all kinds of incentives for Indira Gandhi to exploit anti-Americanism in order to curry favor with her own people.
How much was, do you think, the recent, I mean, we're talking not even 20 years, period of gaining independence from, the British Empire? How much of that was maybe kind of in the background here of like, well, we got another big powerhouse trying to poke their nose in our business and try to make us a little dependent on them. And I wonder how much of that I mean, those are all still people that were alive when that happened. I mean, that had to have been, and then you kind of just like, well, look what they're doing. I mean, they're, bombing and the shit out of this other country and just doing that whole nonsense. And, I wonder just how much of that was kind of going on in the background there.
Yeah, I think it's exactly right. One thing that American policymakers had a really hard time getting their heads around is that Indian political elites, as a consequence of colonialism, would never again want to hitch their wagon to a single foreign power. So the way the Indian political elites navigated the situation across the 1970s and really across much of the Cold War was to try to balance the Soviet Union against the United States. So to a point, Indians wanted a constructive relationship with Washington. But they always wanted that to be balanced with the Soviet Union. And frankly, because the Soviet idea of economic development often ran closer to what was prevalent in India, the Soviets in some ways had a leg up over Americans, who had a free market solution to every problem. But Indian economic political thought really didn't run very much in that direction. So the Soviets, I think, had some advantages in that rivalry with the United States, even though at the end of the day, Indians mostly wanted to balance the two against each other.
Yeah. I guess moving to Iran. So, again, there seems to have been a positive and healthy relationship that LBJ had with the Shah. Obviously, Iran is a very complex place in its recent history. Iran looks wildly different than it did in the 60s. And there was an influence of Khomeini that was there. He was much younger there at the time in the 60s. But just talk about how Iran of the time and the Shah there at the time had a pretty positive relationship with Iran. How did LBJ, kind of navigate that relationship, and then a little bit of how that kind of evolved towards the end of LBJ during the Nixon years, and et cetera.
Yeah. It's maybe my favorite of my case studies, in part because I learned the most. I hadn't really known much about Iran, but such an interesting story. So broadly speaking, it goes like this. At the beginning of the 1960s, the Shah really seemed to be in trouble. There was massive political unrest in Iran. The Shah's days, so Americans feared, might be numbered. Both because of opposition on the left and also because of what would ultimately turn out to be the Shah's biggest problem on the right among clerics and the Shia clergy in Iran. So Americans in 1962, 1963 really worried about what was going to happen in Iran. The loss of such a powerful, pivotally located country, of course, was a real potential nightmare scenario for Americans. And so things stood, I think, when LBJ came into office. And what LBJ, I think, decided pretty early on, along with his advisors, was to double down on the Shah. So if just a year or two earlier, Americans had wondered whether they might want to start cultivating friends in other parts of the Iranian political arena, LBJ sees enough to like in the Shah to really double down on him. And the story thereafter that plays out across the Johnson period, I think, is of the working out of what results at the end of LBJ's presidency is a quite close partnership in which the two men, say the nicest things about each other, and Iran really embraces the role of a regional proxy for the United States. So all of the uncertainty, the unrest of an earlier period really gives way to this rock solid relationship. And then Nixon and Kissinger take that relationship to a whole new level with just astronomical levels of military and, military aid above all, economic aid actually less and less as time passes. But the military relationship became a real centerpiece of American foreign policy globally.
It's interesting because most people know what was going on in Iran in 1979, and so, it's interesting how there's so much groundwork that's laid and all these relationships built, and, obviously in different countries, leaders come and go, but, that there's certain moments that can just change it. And then as the country both, two countries even have bilateral relations. It can change as things are changing in their country, it starts to change the relationship and things like that. But it is interesting how they really kind of had a kind of an alliance with the United States in a very positive kind of way. I think I also did not know that before I read the book. And so it's quite illuminating, because you look at things now, it's very, 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 very tense. So it's just very interesting how in such a short period there's difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are many turning points in the U.S.-Iranian stories, many arguably at least missed opportunities. But I think that the story that I tell is important to what's gone on in more recent times, because it was really very arguably the moment when the United States really abandoned the nuance, the complexity of the policy that had existed in the earlier part of the 1960s and really hitched its wagon 100% to the Shah. And that relationship would, of course, only become closer and closer and closer until it blew up in the late 1970s.
Yeah. So going to Indonesia, there was this September 1965 attack. It's a little controversial. How much was well, tell us what the attack was, and then how much can we say confidently, and how much is speculative of how much LBJ and the administration was kind of involved behind the scenes on that?
Yeah. So the two of my case studies that really speak to each other are Brazil and Indonesia. These were two countries where there were military coups in a very short number of months: April 1964 in Brazil, and the fall, essentially September, October of 1965 in Indonesia. Both of these coups bring to power authoritarian regimes that really solve for the United States a lot of problems connected to leftward drift out of the American orbit, economic chaos, and produce a regime that promises to cooperate very, very closely with the United States. So the question has long been out there: what was the level of American involvement in the coup that brought the military to power in Indonesia? And, I would say a couple of things here. One is that we could still learn interesting things as new archives become available. So I'm not sure the last word has been written on this subject. The generalization, though, that I'm most comfortable with is that, look, the United States had worked hard through various diplomats and military officers to convince key members of the Indonesian military that if they were ever so inclined to carry out a coup against the left-leaning government of Indonesia, the United States would be there for them, would back them up, would provide support in material, equipment, and so forth in the years to come. So I think it's very fair to say that the United States worked hard to establish the general context within which the generals decided to make their move in the fall of 1965. That's not quite the same thing as to say that the United States chose the moment or chose the generals or really micromanaged the process. I think that's a hard argument to make. I think, in fact, there's good evidence that Americans were surprised about the timing and the specific way in which the coup played out. But it's going way too far at the same time to exonerate the United States of any responsibility, because this is the kind of outcome that Americans, at least some Americans in the intelligence and military world, had worked pretty hard to create.
Yeah. I want to ask I want to hit Southern Africa, and then we can have some kind of conclusion kind of questions to ask about, because I definitely want to ask about Nixon and then a few other things. But with Southern Africa, there was a few countries that were involved at the time. And so I don't know, was LBJ interested in this region, or, how did he treat Southern Africa different from all the other countries that you talk about, aside from them not being Asian countries or Middle Eastern countries? But, what was kind of different about it, and how interested was he in the kind of involvement that he had with Southern African countries?
Sure. I think he was, at least compared to Kennedy, much less interested in the affairs of Southern Africa. Kennedy had famously attached a lot of importance to decolonization in this part of the world and believed the United States should be deeply involved in shaping that process and cultivating new friends and allies. I think LBJ was much less interested, in part for reasons we've already touched on. His general level of interest in foreign relations was much lower, I think, than JFK's. And if there was a part of the world where Americans could reasonably say American interests were not particularly engaged, it would have been Southern Africa. So um, it wouldn't have been unreasonable, certainly, to have taken the position that LBJ did at that time. Um, but he finds that it's impossible to dodge Southern Africa entirely because the Cold War seems to be increasingly coming to Southern Africa. It seems to be another battlefield of the Cold War as decolonization plays out. And the case that I look at specifically has to do with the very complicated history of a British territory called Southern Rhodesia, now called Zimbabwe. It has a very convoluted history that played out under LBJ's presidency in the mid 1960s that really, to me, crystallized the fundamental problems that confronted LBJ. As on the one hand, he really tried to avoid becoming deeply embroiled in this part of the world, but on the other hand, felt always compelled to do something because of the Cold War pressures that he faced.
I guess my question here is, so we haven't talked about Vietnam. And we won't talk about Vietnam. That's not really what your book is about. And so, but I guess my one question here is how, because that was so, such a big kind of elephant in the room in terms of foreign affairs for LBJ, and then on the global stage, do you think that kind of, or did impact his reasoning for treating some of these other countries in the way that he did? So, I think that it obviously wasn't LBJ's decision to enter Vietnam. I think he was, we could say, maybe hoodwinked by McNamara. What he chose to stay there. He put more troops there, etc. It was really ugly. They weren't honest, etc. But was that like, well, when we operate with all these other countries, some in the region or nearby or close enough, we're going to give them economic aid. We're going to give them, we're going to let these leaders do what they want. And we're just going to kind of sort of have not an aggressive, not a very hands-on approach. We just want to be, show a different side of how we do things. I mean, that's sort of kind of the one general theme, I guess you could paint. Juxtaposed with the very heavy-handed, very aggressive, very, dark and terrible aspects of the things that we did to Vietnam and the Vietnam War. Is that kind of maybe implicit in this, or maybe explicit? How do you kind of see, I guess, that juxtaposition?
I'm really glad you circled back around to Vietnam, because even though, as you say, I don't spend a lot of time writing specifically about American policymaking in Vietnam, it hangs pretty heavy over the whole book, or at least I hope it does, because that's central
It does.
to my argument. In fact, I at one time was working with a potential title for the book, In the Shadow of Vietnam.
That was a great title.
My press talked me out of that. I was kind of proud of it. But I still like to use that metaphor of the shadow, because I think that is a good way to think about it. Vietnam cast this very long and very dark shadow over everything else, domestic or foreign.
That's right.
And what I try to show is the ways in which the war altered and in many ways distorted American policymaking toward other nations of the global south, or third world countries. And the big story that I try to tell, of course, is that it reduced the this enormous distraction, this endless drain of resources into one place, tended to lower American expectations and ambitions in other parts of the world. So, in a Brazil or in Indonesia, it very much heightened the appeal of authoritarians who, for all their flaws, would cooperate with the United States and serve as regional proxies at a time when the United States faced a lot of problems domestically and internationally. In India, I think the effect of the war was to make Americans impatient with the complexities and the endless haggling that so hung around that relationship. So the effect of the war certainly played out differently in different places, and that's one reason why I have 5 case studies. But overall, I guess I would suggest that the process that I described is really one of the unrecognized tragedies of the Vietnam War. It had the effect, to go back to my title, of sucking the ambition out of American policy in these parts of the world, with consequences that, continued to ripple for many, many years thereafter.
What were there other countries that you considered to put in the book, whether some that you would have replaced or ones you would have added, or were there other countries that you were considering?
Yes, very much so. The one that I really thought long and hard about, right down almost to the last minute when I had to choose, was Egypt.
Interesting.
Which would have taken the place of Iran, since I was trying to get geographical breadth, which is not to say Iran and Egypt, represent the same region, but very broadly speaking, they would have been, I think, mutually exclusive given what I was trying to accomplish. I think that the relationship with Nasser in Egypt is a fascinating one that broadly tells the story that I'm trying to tell in the book of pretty significant ambition, high expectations, a relatively high level of openness to risk-taking at the beginning of the decade gives way over time to impatience, to a tendency to cut ties to leaders who were complicated and demanding and weren't willing to line up squarely alongside the United States. During JFK's time in office, JFK tries to cultivate Nasser with mixed results, but certainly LBJ, really has much less patience for that kind of thing. And, essentially, to put it crudely, I think chooses sides in the Middle East and embraces certainly Saudi Arabia and Iran as 2 of the principal pillars on which American policy would be built. And also, not insignificantly, solidifies the relationship with Israel in a way that went well beyond, I think, what any previous Cold War president had done, to really attach a lot of importance to that relationship as a source of stability in the region.
I have 2 final questions for you. So the next question is a 3-part question. So I have 4 questions left for you, but what was it about? So I'm going to give you as much time to Nixon as you do in the book, right? So I'm going to ask you one question about Nixon. Okay. What was it about Nixon's approach that was different from LBJ's? How much of the policies and approaches that LBJ and previous administrations had with the same countries or different countries was maintained? So kind of this continuity between U.S. foreign policy.
Right.
And third is, what are the parallels between the Nixon doctrine and some of the parallels between that we see with the Obama doctrine and or Trump doctrine, if you will, more recently?
Sure. Okay. Can you go back to the beginning of those 3? And you may need to coach me through those 3.
Sorry. How was it? I mean, the first 2 are kind of similar, but what was it about Nixon's approach that was different from LBJ's? And then what's the continuity between some of the U.S. foreign policy between the previous administrations?
Sure. Well, as I've mentioned, one of the, I think, interesting interpretive points I try to make is that there is more continuity between LBJ and Nixon than historians have generally recognized. Nevertheless, I take your point. There may still be some interesting distinctions between policymaking in those two presidencies. I think that part of it is a rhetorical difference. I think that Nixon and Kissinger, who were, of course, not being Democrats, not anchored to the things that JFK had said at the beginning of the 1960s, they weren't in any way implicated in the ambitions that had been articulated at the beginning of the decade. So they could build policy very explicitly on the basis of this new, more realistic approach. And this is no small difference. They were able actually to embrace it fully, not just to sort of do it when no one was looking, but really to make it the cornerstone of what they offered up as a wholly new approach to American foreign policy that would enable them to disengage to some extent from draining problems in the third world and refocus on what they imagined to be, maybe with some good reason, as the major problems for the United States in the Soviet Union and in China. So I think there is a significant difference there. They were able to make policy more explicitly, more confidently, because they were unencumbered by the earlier history.
And I guess what was the continuity between, Eisenhower, JFK, LBJ, and then Nixon, and then as we progress forward with some of these approaches, in terms of how we understand foreign policy overall, how was that, when these countries are dealing with the United States, it's like, yep, you got a new leader, yep, you got a new president, but it's kind of the same thing going on here. And maybe that goes back to one of the early questions we were mentioning about the lower officials that were kind of running the show on the day-to-day kinds of things. And so how much of that was some continuity in U.S., kind of foreign policies?
I think you're right. I think there's a fair amount of continuity in those basic four schools of thought that I laid out a little while ago. I think to one degree or another, starting with Eisenhower and going down through Nixon, you can see American foreign policy as emerging from the interplay of those different currents. And sometimes, one or two of those are riding high, and then, time passes and the ebb and flow leads to policy of different type. But the other thing I would emphasize by way of continuities, which is something we haven't touched on yet, is that pretty consistently the third world defeats American best ideas about the way in which things have to play out, right? American efforts to impose order, to impose its will in all sorts of places around the globe really achieve partial success at the very best. The world, to put it differently, didn't prove particularly amenable to American desires. So in some ways, what I'm looking at here, I think, is one window of time in a longer story where Americans are pretty constantly frustrated by their inability to impose their will politically, economically, and geostrategically and otherwise on places around the world that had their own agendas and their own interests. That aligned very imperfectly with American ambitions.
And the one point that you make is there's some parallels between Nixon's doctrine and some of the more recent presidents, Obama and Trump. How do you see those parallels there that are similar, I guess?
Yeah, I think that for a time during Obama's presidency, there was a little cottage industry of commentary that likened Obama's approach to foreign policy to Nixon's. And I was sort of drawn by that. I mean, these are obviously very, very different characters who stood for very different things in the domestic arena, so I wouldn't push it too far. Right. But these were both presidents who inherited unpopular wars, who recognized, I think, accurately, that American resources and political capital and all the rest were being funneled into parts of the world that were, at the end of the day, not central to American interests. And so they needed to find a way to refocus, to pivot, if to use Obama's terminology. Nixon's solution to this problem was the so-called Nixon doctrine. He would deal with the third world insofar as he could prioritize stability, just kind of lowering the temperature of problems in the third world and lowering the profile of these problems in the broader American approach to the world so that there would be more time and effort to focus on the things that he believed really mattered. And I think there's something broadly similar that plays out in the Obama period. Neither one of these guys clearly wanted to, quote unquote, lose the war, whether it was Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan. They didn't want to be saddled with that.
Right.
But I think what you see is a kind of concerted effort to disengage from these really problematic ventures that they believed were holding them back from doing something new and big and bold internationally. And as we've seen, I mean, both of them had kind of limited success in those efforts.
Well, this is very, very current. So, take this with a grain of salt. But I think that continued with how Trump kind of got the ball rolling on pulling out of Afghanistan, and then Biden's hands being kind of tied, really. I mean, there's nothing he could, he could have done another option, but that would have been pretty dramatic and maybe not the wisest politically for various reasons. And so he went along with it and agreed and didn't want people there as well. And so, but it kind of goes to the point of, like, I think most people agreed when things kind of died down with, the pullout of Afghanistan, that right decision, but definitely could have been handled way better, so much better, which is quite unfortunate. And again, not too dissimilar to how it happened in Vietnam, which is, history repeats itself, unfortunately. So it's, but again, very recent. We're talking, this happened 4 months ago. So it's just very recent. We get some time away from it, see how it looks. But I guess the final question for you is really one, I guess, about, application, right? So it's, anytime I like to, when I talk to historians that talk about different periods of history, whether it's very, very ancient or more and more recent, I guess the question I always have is especially from this period, is, what lessons can we learn from this period, and how do these policies and procedures and decisions still impact us today, and how can we get the most out of this period to say, okay, here's some things, this is what history is telling us, how can we do a better job within the world, how can we, when we're working with emerging economies, or when we're working with other countries, or more accurately here, if there is another looming shadow, or if there is a big crisis, how can we put that fire out and make sure it doesn't spread to other places in an efficient way? So I guess, what can we really pull from this, and or what would you want people to get the most out of reading your book on this?
I think I would most want people to understand the damaging consequences of an overcommitment to a part of the world that is clearly not the most important to the United States. And another way to say that comes closer to a specific lesson that one might draw is that there's an awful lot of value in the ability to prioritize, to know what's important, to know what's less important, and to have a sense of what is a proportional and sensible response to a problem that may ultimately be solvable, but perhaps not at a cost that is worth paying, given all the other commitments that the United States or any other country, for that matter, has in the world. So I think, the story I try to tell points out that in the early 1960s, Americans identified some very real problems and some very real threats to the United States, some very real opportunities. And through a process of hyper ambition, hyper activism, became deeply involved almost everywhere under the sun, including in one place that became particularly problematic, Vietnam. And as time passed, the drain on American resources and political will really poisoned the whole enterprise. So I think there's a lesson in that about the risks of overcommitment, of trying to do too much and believing that one has more power than one actually does to do nothing less than transform the world.
No, I absolutely agree. Well, look, Mark, you've been more than generous with your time and your energy and your brain power. So I want to respect your time. The book is called The End of Ambition, The United States in the Third World and the Vietnam Era. It's fantastic. Where can people pick this up, and where can they find you and your work and all that wonderful stuff?
Oh, I suppose the book is available anywhere. Fine books are sold. Is that what they say?
Yeah, right.
Certainly online, the normal places. It's just out in November, so get them while supplies last. But there should be plenty. And I teach at the University of Texas at Austin, and I'd be more than happy to be in touch with anyone who might have additional questions or like to have any guidance on the vast scholarship connected to the Vietnam War or the Johnson administration, the Kennedy administration, or American foreign policy across these years.
Yeah, that's great. Well, look, Mark, this was so much fun. I really enjoyed this. So I appreciate you coming on and talking to me about all your hard work and research, and it was really delightful.
Xavier, thank you so much. I appreciate your interest, and can't thank you enough for the really thoughtful interview.
Of course. All right, thank you.